April 30th, 1975. Richard Nixon sat in his study at La Casa Pacifica, his oceanfront estate in San Clemente, California, watching the television with an expression of profound anguish. On the screen, grainy footage showed helicopters evacuating the last Americans from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Desperate South Vietnamese civilians clung to the helicopter skids, trying to escape as North Vietnamese forces closed in on the city. The images were chaotic, humiliating, heartbreaking. Nixon had been out of office for 9 months, having resigned in disgrace over the Watergate scandal in August 1974. But even in exile, even in disgrace, he remained obsessed with foreign policy, with the wars he had fought, with the decisions he had made. And no foreign policy issue had consumed more of his presidency than Vietnam. Now, watching Saigon fall, watching the final collapse of South Vietnam, watching the end of everything he had fought for and sacrificed for, Nixon felt a mixture of rage, grief, and bitter vindication. His wife, Pat, entered the room quietly. She had been with him through everything, the political rises and falls, the triumphs and disasters, the glory years and the disgrace. She knew when he needed to be alone and when he needed company. Right now, seeing his face as he watched the television, she knew he needed company. "Dick," she said softly, sitting down beside him. Nixon didn't look away from the television. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. 20 years, 58,000 American lives, hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's all ending like this, with helicopters fleeing from rooftops, with our allies abandoned, with total defeat. On the screen, another helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof, its rotors beating frantically as it rose into the sky. Below, crowds of Vietnamese pushed against the embassy gates, desperate to escape before the North Vietnamese arrived. "This didn't have to happen," Nixon said, his voice rising with anger. "This collapse, this defeat, this humiliation, none of it had to happen. We had won. In 1973, when we signed the Paris Peace Accords, we had achieved our objectives. South Vietnam was secure. The North Vietnamese had agreed to a ceasefire. We had peace with honor." He turned to look at his wife, his face showing the strain of the past year. The Watergate hearings, the resignation, the exile, the disgrace. And then Congress cut off funding. They abandoned South Vietnam. They refused to provide the military aid that we had promised, that South Vietnam needed to defend itself, and now we're watching the inevitable result. Pat Nixon had heard this before, had heard her husband's bitter complaints about Congress, about the Democrats, about the media, about all the people he blamed for the fall of South Vietnam. She didn't argue with him. She just listened, offering the silent support that she had provided throughout their marriage. "Kissinger called this morning," Nixon said, referring to Henry Kissinger, who had served as his national security advisor and Secretary of State and who remained in that position under President Gerald Ford. He said the evacuation was nearly complete, that most of the Americans had gotten out. But he also said that thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with us, interpreters, officials, soldiers, thousands of them would be left behind. Left behind to face the North Vietnamese, to face imprisonment or execution. Nixon's voice broke slightly. "We promised them. We promised we would stand by them, that we would support them, that we wouldn't abandon them, and now we're leaving them to their fate." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. The view was beautiful. Blue water, white waves, clear sky, but Nixon saw none of it. He was seeing Saigon, seeing the helicopters, seeing the collapse of everything he had worked for. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Nixon said without turning around. "It's not just that we lost. It's that we didn't have to lose. South Vietnam could have survived. The South Vietnamese army, with American air support and military aid, could have held off the North Vietnamese. We proved that in 1972, during the Easter Offensive, when the North Vietnamese launched a massive invasion and we stopped them with air power and support for the South Vietnamese forces. But Congress, Nixon continued, his voice bitter, Congress cut off funding. They passed the Case Church Amendment prohibiting American military involvement in Indochina. They reduced military aid to South Vietnam to a fraction of what was needed. They tied President Ford's hands, preventing him from responding when the North Vietnamese violated the peace agreement and launched this final offensive. He turned back to face his wife. So South Vietnam fell not because it had to fall, not because the North Vietnamese were invincible, but because the United States Congress abandoned our ally. Because the American people lost their will to support the war. Because Watergate destroyed my presidency and prevented me from enforcing the peace agreement. Pat Nixon spoke gently. Dick, you can't blame yourself for everything. The war had been going on for 20 years. The American people were tired of it. Congress reflected that sentiment, and Watergate, that was a separate issue. Watergate destroyed everything, Nixon said harshly. I was handling Vietnam. I had achieved peace with honor. I had brought the troops home while preserving South Vietnam's independence. I had negotiated with China and the Soviet Union to reduce their support for North Vietnam. I was managing the situation, keeping South Vietnam viable. And then Watergate, Nixon continued, his voice filled with bitterness. The break-in, the cover-up, the hearings, the tapes, the impeachment proceedings. My presidency was destroyed. My credibility was destroyed. My ability to conduct foreign policy was destroyed. And Congress, emboldened by my weakness, cut off funding for Vietnam and prohibited military action. He sat back down heavily, suddenly looking old and exhausted. So yes, I blame myself. Not for the war itself. I inherited that from Kennedy and Johnson. But for Watergate, for the mistakes that led to my resignation, for the weakness that allowed Congress to abandon South Vietnam. If I had remained strong, if I had maintained my authority, South Vietnam might have survived. On the television, the coverage continued. Reporters described the chaos in Saigon, the collapse of South Vietnamese resistance, the rapid advance of North Vietnamese forces. The American ambassador had left hours earlier. The last Marines were being evacuated from the embassy roof. The war was ending in complete defeat. Nixon watched in silence for a moment, then said quietly, I was in the White House on January 27th, 1973, when we signed the Paris Peace Accords. I gave a speech that evening, announcing that we had achieved peace with honor, that American involvement in Vietnam was ending, that South Vietnam would remain independent and secure. I believed it, Nixon continued. I believed we had achieved our objectives. We had withdrawn American combat forces, we had secured the release of our POWs, we had negotiated a ceasefire that left South Vietnam intact. Yes, North Vietnamese forces remained in South Vietnam in violation of the agreement, but we had made clear that we would respond with force if they violated the ceasefire. And for a while it worked, Nixon said. The ceasefire held, more or less. South Vietnam remained independent. The war seemed to be over. I had accomplished what I set out to do, ending American involvement while preserving South Vietnam. But it all depended on American credibility, Nixon continued. It depended on the North Vietnamese believing that we would respond if they violated the agreement. It depended on Congress continuing to provide military aid to South Vietnam. It depended on my ability to conduct foreign policy and enforce the peace. And then Watergate destroyed all of that, Nixon said, his voice heavy with regret. My credibility was destroyed. Congress turned against me, cut off funding, prohibited military action. The North Vietnamese realized that America would not respond, that they could violate the peace agreement with impunity. And so they launched this final offensive, and South Vietnam collapsed. Pat Nixon reached over and took her husband's hand. You did what you thought was right. You tried to end the war honorably. You tried to preserve South Vietnam. It didn't work out the way you hoped, but that doesn't mean you didn't try. Nixon squeezed her hand but didn't respond. He was thinking about all the decisions he had made regarding Vietnam, all the strategies he had pursued, all the hopes he had held. When he had taken office in January 1969, the war had been raging for years. Over 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. Casualties were mounting. The American public was turning against the war. Nixon had inherited a disaster, and he had tried to find a way out that didn't involve simply abandoning South Vietnam to communist conquest. His strategy had been Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American combat forces while building up the South Vietnamese military to defend itself. Combined with diplomatic pressure on China and the Soviet Union, with continued American air support and military aid, with negotiations to reach a peace agreement, Nixon had believed he could end American involvement while preserving South Vietnam's independence. And for a while, it had seemed to work. American troop levels had declined from over 500,000 in 1969 to zero combat forces by 1973. The Paris Peace Accords had been signed. American prisoners of war had come home. The war had seemed to be over. But the peace had been fragile, dependent on continued American support and credibility. And when Watergate destroyed Nixon's presidency, when Congress cut off funding and prohibited military action, the peace had collapsed. The North Vietnamese had launched their final offensive in early 1975, and South Vietnam, without American support, had crumbled in a matter of weeks. "I ordered the bombing of Cambodia," Nixon said suddenly, his voice distant. "I expanded the war into Laos. I ordered the Christmas bombing of Hanoi in 1972. I made decisions that resulted in thousands of deaths. American deaths, Vietnamese deaths, Cambodian deaths, Laotian deaths. I made those decisions," Nixon continued, "because I believed they were necessary to achieve an honorable peace, to preserve South Vietnam, to prevent communist conquest of Indochina. I believed that if we showed strength, if we demonstrated our willingness to use force, we could negotiate from a position of power and achieve a lasting peace." "And it worked," Nixon said. "The Christmas bombing brought the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table. The peace agreement was signed. We achieved what we set out to achieve." "But now," Nixon said, looking at the television where the evacuation continued, "now it's all collapsing. All those decisions, all those deaths, all that effort, it was all for nothing. South Vietnam is falling. The communists are winning. Everything we fought for is being lost." He stood up again and walked back to the window. "Do you know what history will say? History will say that Vietnam was a mistake from the beginning, that we never should have been there, that all the deaths and all the costs achieved nothing. History will say that I prolonged a war that couldn't be won, that I expanded the conflict unnecessarily, that I was responsible for years of pointless bloodshed. And maybe history will be right," Nixon said quietly. "Maybe Vietnam was unwinnable from the start. Maybe no amount of American military power could have created a viable, independent South Vietnam. Maybe all we did was delay the inevitable, at enormous cost in lives and treasure." Pat Nixon stood and walked over to her husband, putting her hand on his shoulder. "Or maybe you did give South Vietnam a chance. Maybe you created a situation where South Vietnam could have survived, if only Congress had maintained support. Maybe the failure wasn't in your strategy, but in the American people's loss of will." Nixon turned to look at his wife. "That's what I tell myself. That's what I want to believe. That we achieved peace with honor in 1973. That South Vietnam could have survived. That the collapse was due to Congress cutting off funding and not to any fundamental flaw in our strategy." "But I don't know," Nixon admitted. "I don't know if that's true or if it's just an excuse, a way of avoiding responsibility for a failed policy. I don't know if South Vietnam ever had a real chance of surviving, or if we were just postponing the inevitable." On the television, a reporter announced that the last American helicopter had left Saigon. The evacuation was complete. The American presence in Vietnam was over. Within hours, North Vietnamese forces would enter Saigon, and the South Vietnamese government would surrender. The war was ending in total communist victory. Nixon watched in silence, his face showing the pain of defeat. Then he said, more to himself than to his wife, 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese died fighting alongside us. We spent over $100 billion. We fought for 20 years. And it's all ending like this. I tried, Nixon said, his voice breaking. I tried to find a way out that preserved South Vietnam, that honored the sacrifices that had been made, that didn't simply abandon our allies. I tried to achieve peace with honor. And I failed, Nixon continued. Whether because of Watergate, or because of Congress, or because of fundamental flaws in our strategy, or because Vietnam was never winnable, I failed. South Vietnam is falling, and I bear responsibility for that failure. He turned away from the television, unable to watch anymore. This is my legacy. Not the opening to China, not détente with the Soviet Union, not the achievements in foreign policy. This, he gestured at the television. This defeat, this humiliation, this collapse. This is what I'll be remembered for. Pat Nixon put her arms around her husband. You'll be remembered for many things, Dick, the good and the bad. The successes and the failures. That's how history works. Nixon didn't respond. He just stood there, holding his wife, watching through the window as the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, thinking about Vietnam and Watergate and all the ways his presidency had ended in failure and disgrace. Later that evening, after Pat had gone to bed, Nixon sat alone in his study, writing in his diary. He wrote about watching Saigon fall, about the pain of seeing 20 years of American effort collapse in a matter of weeks, about his thoughts on what had gone wrong and who was to blame. And he wrote what he really thought, what he had said to himself while watching the television coverage. This is the end of everything I fought for in Vietnam. 20 years of American involvement, 6 years of my own efforts as president to find an honorable exit, all ending in complete defeat and humiliation. I achieved peace with honor in 1973. I negotiated the Paris Peace Accords, brought the troops home, secured the release of our POWs, preserved South Vietnam's independence. It was one of my greatest achievements, ending American involvement in Vietnam while avoiding the disaster of simply abandoning our ally. But the peace was fragile. It depended on continued American support for South Vietnam. It depended on American credibility, on the North Vietnamese believing that we would respond if they violated the agreement. It depended on my ability to conduct foreign policy and enforce the peace. And then Watergate destroyed everything. My presidency collapsed, my credibility evaporated, my ability to conduct foreign policy was undermined. Congress, emboldened by my weakness, cut off funding for Vietnam and prohibited military action. The North Vietnamese, recognizing that America would not respond, launched their final offensive. And now, South Vietnam is falling, the government is collapsing, the army is disintegrating, the Americans are fleeing from rooftops. Everything we fought for, everything we sacrificed for, is being lost. Who is to blame? Congress, for cutting off funding and abandoning our ally. The American people for losing the will to support the war. The media for turning public opinion against our efforts. The North Vietnamese for violating the peace agreement. The South Vietnamese for failing to defend their own country effectively. But most of all, I blame myself. I blame myself for Watergate, for the mistakes and crimes that led to my resignation. I blame myself for not being stronger, for not maintaining my authority, for not preventing Congress from abandoning South Vietnam. If I had remained strong, if I had maintained my presidency, South Vietnam might have survived. I could have enforced the peace agreement, provided the necessary military aid, used American air power to stop the North Vietnamese offensive. I could have preserved what we achieved in 1973. But I didn't. I failed. And now I'm watching the consequences of that failure on television, watching Saigon fall, watching our allies abandoned, watching 20 years of American effort end in complete defeat. This is my legacy. Not the opening to China, not détente with the Soviet Union, not the environmental or domestic policy achievements. This defeat in Vietnam, combined with the disgrace of Watergate, will be what I'm remembered for. And I deserve it. I made the mistakes that led to Watergate. I failed to prevent the collapse of South Vietnam. I bear responsibility for these failures, regardless of how much I want to blame Congress or the media or anyone else. 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. They died believing they were fighting for something important, for the defense of freedom, for the containment of communism, for American honor and credibility. And now their sacrifice seems meaningless, wasted, thrown away in a defeat that didn't have to happen. I think about those 58,000 Americans. I think about the decisions I made that resulted in some of them dying, the Cambodia incursion, the Laos operation, the Christmas bombing, the continued fighting while we negotiated. I made those decisions believing they were necessary, believing they would lead to an honorable peace. And we did achieve peace in 1973. For 2 years, the peace held. South Vietnam remained independent. The war seemed to be over. My decisions seemed to have been vindicated. But the peace was temporary. It collapsed when American support was withdrawn, and now all those deaths seem to have been for nothing. Was Vietnam winnable? Could we have achieved a lasting peace that preserved South Vietnam's independence, or was the whole enterprise doomed from the start, a futile effort to